I'm Monica Johnson with Marshall Weber, and this is Booklyn Calling. Hello. Welcome to our show. Booklyn Calling is where we talk about artists, libraries, and social justice. We're Booklyn Inc., an arts nonprofit located in Brooklyn, New York, on the unceded land of the Munsee Lenape people. We're your hosts, Monica and Marshall. We're both artists, and we also head up Booklyn Inc. We created Booklyn Calling so that we could amplify voices in the artist book field and to explore art making as a tool for community engagement and for social change. And today, we're going to continue to retrace our organization's roots. We're going to look back on, over a few episodes, look back on Booklyn's 25 plus years of history, on the story of how a group of artists organize themselves and how that's turned into what we know and love today as the functional, happy, sustainable arts nonprofit organization that we are, that continues to be artist-led. And hopefully we're not jinxing our continued stability by talking about it. But today, our special guest is Ruth Lingen. Not Lingen, as I just recently figured out, asked and answered. She's been sort of lurking within and around Booklyn for many years, as I understand it. I met Ruth about 7 years ago, I think. And there's so much more that I'm about to learn about Ruth. But yeah, it feels weird to not have you say hi. Do you want to say hi, Ruth, and then I'll read your bio?
Well, I'd love to say hi, and I like the phrase that you said, I was lurking around Brooklyn, because I do kind of feel that's my relationship is I pop in every year with a new project or every 2 years, and then I'll disappear. I'll vanish back into the ether.
But not really, because we've done such huge projects with you, and you've been such a giant supporter that we never feel like you're gone.
Okay, good.
So let me tell you more about Ruth Lingen here. This could be a surprise for Ruth, and I'm just gonna guess we'll have a more complete bio in the show notes. So don't take my word for it on this one, but there's so much more to her story. But here's what we know in writing: that as a shop worker for the legendary New York printmaker Joe Wilfer and Midwest bookmaster, Walter Hamady, Ruth Lingen learned both her trade and the pleasure of collaborating with living artists. In the years since, she herself has become somewhat of a legend, collaborating with nearly 50 of the world's greatest artists on prints, some for Pace editions, some for her own, and very limited edition artist books. She's worked with Jim Dine, Robert Ryman, Mary Heilmann, Kiki Smith, Claes Oldenberg, Jessica Stockholder, John Chamberlain, and I actually edited that list. There's so many more. Just to name a few, Ruth's work can be found in the collection of the Metropolitan Museum of Art, the Getty, and the Brooklyn Museum, as well as more than 20, I'm sure it's more than 20 libraries, to be honest. Welcome, Ruth, and let's get to talking. Marshall, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I would love to dive right in, because one thing about Ruth is that we have been lucky to have garnered so much of her support, both as a loyal artist, as just kind of our ears and eyes into the entire art world, and that place where activism and fine art and gallery art and museum art and poetry all meets together. Ruth is kind of a great example of an interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary artist that Booklyn tends to represent. And she was also one of our first artists that came from outside our little social scene, but interestingly, part of the Madison, Wisconsin, New York City pipeline of artists that formed almost all of the participants of the early Booklyn. And so we're really interested in hearing your perspective on that, Ruth, that kind of early history.
I remember that, yes, and I want to say it was the late 90s, that Christopher, I kept getting these messages, and I don't remember if they were phone messages or email, but it must have been phone, because very sweet sounding. Hello, my name's Christopher Wilde, and I was a student of Walter Hamady's, and he said to get in touch. And I think he called me 3 or 4 times. I would kind of go, yeah, yeah, okay, I'm busy. So I finally, met with him, and he was so wonderful, as Christopher is, and so smart. And so, we started, sort of meeting up, and he wanted me to, bring out the wares I had at that time. And of course, by then I was already 10 years into New York. And when I first got here, I would take my $35 limited edition books and go to things like the New York Book Fair and sit there and sell, 5 copies with the 2 other letterpress people in the city. And Christopher impressed me with his intellect and his ability to talk about, work. And of course, we had the shared history of Walter Hamady, which was, can't be really understated as sort of a profound influence, certainly in my bookmaking career. I mean, he was the reason I went to Madison to graduate school, because I'd studied with John Rousseau in undergrad and made several artist books there. And he said, you really need to go to Madison and study with Walter Hamady. And Christopher, kind of lured me into the Booklyn, field, and told me all about, I met with him. He told me how the bookmobile was, you had traveled around the country. I guess you were in on that, Marshall, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you guys had just done that trip, and he was very interested in meeting other people that had studied with Hamady. So that was my first encounter with Christopher. And he did end up working for me in one of the Pace studios. And, he would come in, and it was great entertainment to have Christopher around. So I did hire him to actually rip up giant reject Chuck Close pieces that were like 6 by 7 feet, which he found deeply disturbing, but I made him do it. And so, we sort of, bonded then. And then, I can't remember the exact details of how I, gave Christopher books, but it happened somehow early on. I can't remember what the earliest thing would have been.
There were 2 books that drew me into the artist book world, because I found most at that time in the 90s, I found all the letterpress, fine press stuff extremely boring. And I remember seeing, I've spoken a lot about Ken Campbell's 10 Years of Uzbekistan, but the other book was your book, I Know Where I'm Going, with Lois Lane, which looked like no other book I'd ever seen, because it was this incredible combination of, like, I don't know, 8 different mediums and collage, and it had this velvet cover, and it was just so lush, and the text wasn't idiotic or written by a dead person. I was just so impressed with just how beautiful and tactile and sophisticated the design of that book was. It really stood out to me. Like, I felt like, oh, there's a whole other universe here that had not been yet revealed, and so that was quite interesting.
Thank you, Marshall. That was a really fun collaboration that went on with Lois Lane, and I believe the publication date of that was 1997. I had a little shop out in Williamsburg at that time, Williamsburg proper, South 3rd Street. And Lois was an artist I'd worked with on a few prints at Pace Prints, and so I loved her sense of collage and her ability to make these decisions about collage that were so decisive. And it was during her tenure that Joe Wilfer and I came up with this quote about collage and just work in general, which is, anyone can fix it, but can you leave it? It's really like she had this confidence in putting, this minimal amount of things together and being like, that's it, like a chess player or something.
Mm-hmm.
And, the tendency sometimes with collage is to overwork, or even any kind of printmaking or even bookmaking is to kind of overwork. And she was brilliant at not doing that. So I did what I always do, which is just work with artists that, kind of come across my footpath. And I said, oh, we should do a project at my studio. And so we began that, and just we went through several different kind of cycles of narrative ideas, it being a non-narrative narrated book with really very little text. And that kind of came out of the books actually that I did in Walter Hamady's class, which is very funny because he was such a typographer. And I would show up to these critiques in Madison in class in grad school with these books that were completely visual. And I'd say, what's he going to say? It's only the title page and the colophon that are printed with type, and so that was always kind of a running joke. But and so I love doing those kind of books, which are just very, very visual, and like I used to call them, a very elegant, formalized sketchbook in some way. So Lois's project was really taking her collage ideas and formalizing them and making all the components from all these different techniques that went into them, and sort of having a bit of an ambiguous, narrative that you could read into it. And we just had a lot of fun with that project.
There's something you mentioned, Ruth, that I find really interesting in terms of your place in the meeting between fine arts press and fine arts prints. Um, a lot of people, when they left letterpress behind, or when they left, handset type and all those things, they kind of went on to other mediums within artist books, screen print, other media. But you were one of the first people that were, I mean, you're like the opposite of lazy to me. Like, I've never seen anyone who is so productive or committed to like the, the cooperative socialist culture of the print shop, and so I feel like most people, when they when they left fine press and they went into artist books, they were like, well, handset type and all that is a real pain in the butt, so I'm just going to leave that behind. But it seems like it's always in your toolkit to do all these difficult media within the book form, with no looking back. So it's, a lot of people be like, well, like you said, you did this whole book of collage, but then you hand set the colophon. Like, a lot of people wouldn't do that.
Hmm.
A lot
Yes.
of people would like tip in that text or like screen print it in or just make a poly plate. But
Yes.
but but you and Ken Campbell were these two people who I always looked at and I said, do these people want to make it more difficult for themselves when they make an artist book? Like, do they need to have 8 different media in every book? So can you address that issue of, multimedia artist books?
Yes. Yes, I would love to. Well, I do feel like, and the way I've approached bookmaking over the years, when I look at all the different books, is I don't think it's unlike something I once read, to quote Bob Dylan, where he said, writing a song is like entering a strange country, and you have to go in there completely, or something like that, right? So I think when I make a book, I try to leave behind the other books I've done and enter this world of what that book wants. And I do think, like, at a certain point, you get into the book and you start and you struggle and you think about it. And that's why I love collaborative books, because two brains, are better than one. You always come up with something more interesting, diverse, different from what you've done before, and a new set of challenges. So I think it's really about that, about not getting too formulaic with what you're doing. Some, that was always the mantra that was at the studios I worked at, which was, we don't have a singular look. We want to do whatever is appropriate for the project. And that certainly involves all the different printing things that, I have access to, and paper making as well. And I love all the, as Hamady said, the attendant arts of bookmaking, which is the paper making, the typography. I love all of it, even though you will find me many days cursing because of it, because I've challenged myself overly with setting some stupid like 8-point type justified on a long line or something. But I like, and I do believe I can see the difference between polymer plate printing and letterpress. People are going to want to argue me to death on this, but I see it because there are these weird imperfections with letterpress where one letter is slightly heavy, and it gives, to me, it gives a liveliness and a vibrancy. And I say you won't necessarily see it, but you'll feel it. To me, it feels very different than a letterpress or than a polymer plate that's like bonked really deeply, like I call it the braille, very derisively. But because I'm still kind of lighting the torch for letterpress, having just finished 2,200 broadsides with poet Reginald Dwayne Betts that I'm just putting away the type for. And anyway, so to get back to your question about printmaking and paper making and including all those things, it's really about talking to the artist, thinking about the project as the project's evolving from the first dummy to the second dummy, the third dummy. Each time it progresses and changes, and until you get to the point where, yeah, this is how it's going to be, and it feels like it's a final thing when you're looking at it. And at that point, you produce, the edition. And I am committed to edition books. I like editioning because I feel like it is a sort of, I love the accessibility, the proletarian versions. I love all of it because I want them to be accessible. So even sorting through works and pulling out one of everything, which I've been doing this past couple of years, I get very sad when I get down to my last 2 copies because I think, oh no, what am I going to do? So I feel the pain of being like a painter or somebody who would have to just get rid of their only copy.
I'm curious about something because I mean this is interesting to just kind of feel more about like your relationship to the art form and why you do things the way that you do things, like Marshall's describing, like seemingly like making it difficult, which you're just asking what the book itself needs, and that's what it needs. But okay, so when I met you, I also met Booklyn. So that means I met Marshall. And Marshall has always said, I don't know, you probably heard this and maybe it's embarrassing, I don't know, but he always refers to you as a rock star. Do you know this? She's such a rock star. She's such a, and then like we were talking about this last week as we were preparing for the podcast. I'm like, why do you say that? Like, it doesn't feel like Ruth is a person who I know to walk around and be like, I am a rock star. But he said that like people walk up to you and get excited, like that he's seen it happen over and over again. And I wonder if, with no pressure to accept the term rock star, but you should if that feels right. But like, why do you think that people get excited when they, come up and talk to you?
Well, I think it is because I do embrace a lot of different things, and I embrace a lot of different work from a lot of different people. It may not necessarily be what I want to do myself personally, but I I think that's really it because I really like a lot of different genres and I love printmaking, I love paper making, I love bookmaking. I enjoy the process a lot and I really love setting type and messing around with my type. Nothing makes me happier than a sunny day where I can just fart around with my type. It doesn't happen often, but I know I've always been shocked when people say they find composing type boring and they hate it. I'm always stunned by that.
What do you like about it?
I like the sort of, basic mathematics of it, that it follows a system of interchange with all the other point sizes. I like the sort of economics of it, that once you have your type, you can set it up, print it, and then you just put it away and it's done. And you start over again. You don't have to buy these plates and then throw them out. And I like the kind of funkiness that, I mean, I don't love it. The funkiness that happens to the type, I know all the stats from American Type Founders, and I have been lucky because I've acquired a lot of foundry type over the years. I always say I fell in love with it because it's like jewelry. It's like perfectly cast, just beautifully cast things. I now have the whole run of Walter Hamady's Saban type, which was cast in Germany, and I'm scared to use it. I'm just now pulling it out to use, and that stuff is just impeccable because Walter was a perfectionist, and it's beautifully cast. and gorgeously just laid into the case. And I think I probably fell in love with it so much because Walter had such great type in the student shop in Madison, and it was in great shape. And it's just great to handle, and I love the precision of the casting and the beauty of the letter form, like, sitting there in its position on the body of the type.
I want to go back to the rock star thing because uh, I, I mean, basically, Ruth has a big audience. She has a lot of fans. She has a lot of students. And I think what's interesting to me is that when Booklyn first started, we were non-entities. You know, first of all, we were weirdo artists, punk, squatty weirdos. Definitely not part of the publishing or mainstream art world. And all these great people kind of mentored us and supported us. I felt like people work with us sort of because they felt sorry for us, and
Do
and
you
we
think
would.
that's true?
I don't
I
know.
think it used to be that way, but I
Yeah,
don't think it's that way
Oh.
anymore.
we would go to curators and librarians, and they would say to us, "How is it that you guys are working with Ruth Lingen?" And it's like, well, we kind of did because we would be like, okay, here's a book by all these people you never heard of, and here's a Chuck Close book, or here's a Kiki Smith book, and a lot of these art world people you introduced us to, and so I always kind of always wondered why at the beginning, like, what was it about Booklyn and participation in Booklyn? Because you've been a big supporter of Booklyn in lots of different ways. You helped us get a couple of ways of doing something book
Yes.
that Booklyn distributed for Chuck Close, and then you helped with that going into a trade edition, and like all this stuff that really increased our profile astronomically.
And
And
also, not even just like making connections, but like one of the major ways that I got to know you, Ruth, is you tabled at, Booklyn did a artist book and zine fair at a public school a few years ago. I think it was like exactly right before the lockdown of the pandemic, and you just had a table along with a bunch of other folks that were just like, I'm making zines. I'm like, and then there's just Ruth Lingen at a public school, and I'm like, this is interesting.
You know why? It took me back to my early years in New York where you would just take your modest fares and sit at some table, and sell
Yep.
stuff. It wasn't like the pretension of a $5,000 booth at a fair that you can't get into or whatever. I mean, I love that accessibility and I always have. And me rooting for Brooklyn all those years was, Marshall, it was a little bit, self-serving because you guys were selling my books and, I was like, got to keep you in business. Early on, it was hard to find, there were a few book dealers around and, so when you guys came along, it was a giant saving grace for me. I mean, I did work with several other book dealers over the years. But, I was so happy with you guys because you were all so jolly and, just fun. And I loved the bookmobile that you drove around the country in. I don't think I ever actually saw it though. And I also, you guys were very interested in the intellectual part of making these things because there's always been a contingency of people making artist books, that are not to say we're not craft based, but that are, much more craft based.
you're someone that was very interesting to me because you have all these traditional and technical skills, but you also always focus on the subject matter. Like it's oh, you're never noodling around, and you're never like dropping the needle. You're not reprinting dead people stuff. You always work really closely with living poets and living artists. You never put the technical stuff ahead of the content, even though your work
Hmm.
was definitely the most impeccable printed work I've seen, especially in New York City. So I think that was fascinating to all of us. And also you were a woman in this like dude world that
Yes.
like
Yes.
seemed really conservative from
Mhm.
the Booklyn perspective of like, crusty punk squatter anarchists, it just
Yes. It was a man's world when I started out for sure. Um, But yeah, to just mention that about, bookbinding, much to the chagrin of my longtime collaborator in bookbinding, Mark Tomlinson, who was so fantastic. And he had a great sort of attitude about binding too. He had those technical skills, but no need to really like put them front and center and show them off like that as a means in and of itself. And again, it's when I go to the New York Public Library Rare Book Room or someplace like that, or I see those kind of bindings, I have a great appreciation for them, but it's not something that, I want to focus on personally.
But beyond that, you also were kind of a soup to nuts person. Like
Yes.
for some of your books, you would make the paper, do all the production work. Sometimes you would do the binding,
Yes.
and there are very few people who are paper makers, printmakers, artists, and technically proficient printers.
Thank you, Marcia. Well, yes, I'm working on a project now with poet Reginald Dwayne Betts, and I met him through a printer from the Lower East Side, Eric, and he he said, if you want to make paper, you should contact Ruth Lingen because they had talked about how can we make some paper to print some of these things on. Eric Haugen, I should say, and so they reached out. Eric reached out to me and said, I'd like you to meet these guys, talk to them about paper making. And so I went up and talked to them, and I ended up making one or two of the pages for this giant project called Redaction. The sheets were shown. It was mostly prints, and there was one poem on this black handmade paper that I made with items that Dwayne had sourced from being in prison. And he was incarcerated for 8.5 years. And he always spoke to me about a prison being a place of materials, like where materials come from in such an interesting way. So I said, can you source materials for us and I'll make sheets of paper out of this? And so that's what happened for that project. And it was a single page for that. But we have gone on to do other projects, most notably a selection of haikus that he wrote that were directly related to his incarceration. And we printed on 20 by 30-inch sheets of paper made from sweatpants that were all shipped to me or Dwayne got from people that were still inside or recently released. And so that was pretty wild because making paper from, polyester cotton sweatpants. I've made paper from fabric, and in fact, that's what I studied with Walter Hamady way back in the day too, and have consistently done paper making as well all these years. And so I really thought, oh, this is going to be terrible because it's just going to foam up. What happens is when you're running the fabric in the beater, it anything synthetic will just foam up and make this kind of gross sludge on the top and just bubble out of the beater like this monster coming alive. But it didn't happen in this case, and I think it was because the things had been washed and worn hundreds and hundreds
Mm,
of times.
right. They
And
were so worn out.
yes, they were so
They're
worn
worn
out.
down for you. They went
They
through a beater before you.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, they made absolutely amazing, like, soft and limp, like,
Mm.
no strength left in this paper from these, the rags I started with. But, it looks and feels exactly like sweatpants. It's quite uncanny.
So
So
when I got a question. When you say beater, I'm picturing like a paint bucket with a little like top attachment.
oh,
Is
no,
that
it's a real Hollander beater,
oh
yeah.
like can you
Yeah.
describe it a little bit? Like are there
Sure.
blades and things in
Yeah, you
there?
could Google Hollander beater and you'll see it. It's a big metal machine and you fill it up with water and then you feed in the amount of, rag you want to make. And, I've worked with all different sizes and different beaters. This one was made by David Rena in Brooklyn, and you feed in the rags and you macerate them. They're sort of being shredded because there's what's called a dandy roll and it's coming down against a bed plate, which is, so it's basically metal on metal, and you keep the blades. It's a spinning wheel with blades on it that are quite sharp. So they come around but they don't cut it like a blender. They like shredded apart as it goes through. You bring the bed plate and the roll closer and closer together until they're, pretty much touching. And it slowly, pulls the fibers apart and also engulfs them in water. So they become very hydrophilic and they swell up and absorb and love the water.
And do you have to add anything like chemical to like help it break down a
No,
little bit?
not when you're breaking it down. Sometimes, I'll cook the rags in soda ash, but with these, if they're well-worn rags, which is what Walter Hamady always said we should be collecting, and I did collect tons of rags around the town of Madison. You want to get well-washed and well-worn rags because all the sizing and additives have been washed out of them. So whatever color you have in the fabric is what the paper will turn into. So Dwayne started sourcing me all these different things. We started talking about the book, a couple years ago, and he gave me all these bright, the bright orange, what you think of as those orange prison shirts. And they were t-shirts. I got this giant box of them. So right now I'm sitting on like 130 of those. I've got like 70 pieces of sweatpant paper. I've been slowly just kind of slogging away making these sheets. And the most unbelievable thing are these towels that are handed out to inmates that are supposed to last them for 8 years, I think. And those things were insane to break down. They did not want to be broken down into
Wow.
paper. I'll tell you that. They were tough. I've never seen cotton be tougher. I kept looking at them going, why are these impossible to beat down? But the paper made from that, it couldn't be more different from the sweatpant paper. It is strong as nails. It is
Did
Wow.
crazy.
did you
So,
already say like what like how did you get? I know what the material where the materials were from,
yes.
but like did you just ask for them or how did you
No,
get?
Dwayne sourced them all for me.
What does
So
that mean?
he wrote and called
Uh huh.
friends of his that are still incarcerated,
Uh huh.
that are, serving long sentences. And I started getting these boxes, these,
Huh.
beat up looking boxes. And, I have giant boxes from the Virginia correctional, facilities stamped all
So
over.
in other words, you shouldn't have them. Like they were just sort of like
Yeah,
bundled
no,
and
he
sent
he
out.
sourced them for me. And well, but what I found out in the process of this is nonprofits can buy products that are made in prisons. Isn't that
What?
crazy?
Yes.
That is
How?
insane. I don't know. I don't want to even think
Yeah.
about it. It's so depressing. But and
Like.
I've never looked into it beyond, hearing that. But the t-shirts, I
Mhm.
made a lot of white paper out of these t-shirts and they're sewn up in prison. So some of them, part of it's made there, some were things that were there being used, and some were worn clothes. So they're all different statuses of these pieces of fabric that I cut up. And I've saved all the trim and the tags that say, where they're made and all that stuff. So that's all going to come together in this book project that we're working on. So I think it'll be great because I have about 8 colors of this prison paper, and it is kind of a transforming process where you take these really ratty, there's a lot of old socks and underwear, long johns and stuff in there. And once you cut them up, and once you wash them, cut them up, run them through the beater, they come out and you make sheets of paper that look white and beautiful. And, they're the orange sheets are kind of disturbing because they do not lose any of that brilliant color, but the things that are like neutral colored, the gray, the white, I have some tan things and I got some purple stuff. So, but they're very transformed when they get to the end of the process.
I recently had a chance to work for you at the Brooklyn Fine Art Print Fair at the Powerhouse in Gowanus. And basically, I would say literally every other person who walked past the booth at this giant print fair knew you, had worked with you, had bought your work, or you had worked for them, or you had taught them, and just hordes of people like saying, "Oh, I work at Tamman. Oh, Ruth taught me this," or "I work at Pace. Oh, Ruth taught me this," and "I work at Gagosian, and Ruth taught me that," and "I work at Dudonay, and Ruth taught me that," and "I work at UW Madison, and Ruth taught me here," or "I interned with Ruth there." Like, is it hundreds of people you've worked with, taught
Yeah, it
thousands of
probably is.
people?
It probably is because, at Pace Paper Mill in Gowanus, I used to hire multiple interns a year, like 5 or 6, so right off the bat, and it's been my world for a very long time, and it's in a weird way, it's a small world, and people kind of dip in and out of it, so you'll run into somebody that you haven't seen in 10 years or whatever, and moving around, doing projects in different places, so it's just you do meet a lot of people along the way. You really do.
So with that in mind, can you talk about this thing, the Madison Mafia, and what that hidden print history, um, I don't know, movement is about?
Okay, well, the Madison Mafia, from my understanding, was just something that, was and kind of goes on but it was very revved up by Joe Wilfer, and he had come out to substitute for Walter Hamady for one semester. So I became his assistant, and he was born and raised in Racine, Wisconsin, the home of Owen H. Kringle, which, I came to love, and many other things. Um, and he was just such a blast, and he was so fun and energetic and had such a creative, generous spirit. And he said he was working on all these giant oversized papermaking projects in New York. So I just set my heart on moving to New York and working for Joe, which I think I self-actualized or whatever they call it, because I did come to New York. Joe was hooking me up with people in the art world back then. He was the Wisconsinite who had already come to New York, to the East Coast, and he was running Skowhegan for a bit and setting up, and he had worked briefly for Dudonay, pulling artists in, and then he really clicked with Chuck and was setting up these different places to work on giant editions with Chuck Close. So that was so exciting to see. I'd never seen anything like that. These complex, huge Philip glass portraits, 5 by 6 feet, done in handmade paper, 24, 48 shades of gray. I was so blown away by it. And Joe was just so much fun to be around. And, so as I said, just coming out there, he was so pro Wisconsin. So he started doing this thing where anyone from Wisconsin knew, contact Joe Wilfer. I must have printed 4 or 5 or 6 of his quote business cards that were like Wisconsin Mafia, the Wisconsin Club, New York
Seriously?
sector. We
Oh my
always
God.
had people coming by the studio that would just pop in. Hi, it's Bill Weege and his wife and students. We had so many tours. And I made this giant banner, which I still have, that's like the Wisconsin Club welcomes. And we would write somebody's name in and tape it up. And I remember once Hamady came to New York and we put the Wisconsin banner up for him. And he was very snide about the lettering, something not perfect with my brush script banner. But
Ew.
but anyway, so that was really the Wisconsin Club was Joe Wilfer. And we used to get on the
Huh.
cover of the UW alumni. It was really UW alumni is what it was, I think.
Mm.
John Bach was a big part of it. So anyone who had a Wisconsin connection would come to the shop, and Joe had been collecting Tom and Jerry bowls. So he always served them at the holidays. So he turned it into an official party, which also kind of became known as like the big Wisconsin Mafia party. So anyone would come to the studio, and we'd make Tom and Jerry's, and we would get in the UW alumni newsletter. We'd have a picture of us in there, serving up to all the Wisconsinites. So I think the word on the street was, oh, pop in and visit, Joe and Ruth. And then eventually the collection moved over to the Tom and Jerry bar, where it still is. And the party went on for years. And at the holidays, COVID kind of shut it down, sadly, but it went for a very long time. And so anyone, who was from Wisconsin was always, warmly greeted. And so people knew, like we had students, people knew from Wisconsin knew. I don't know if Christopher had heard about it when I met him. I think it was really through a Walter connection.
I think also it's hard to imagine how influential this pipeline was. I mean, I'm just going to name a handful of the people that come from it. The Madison Pipeline brought us Kevin Henke and the Hungry Caterpillar. It brought us Amos Kennedy. Um, it brought Christopher Wilde and me. I taught at the UW. He went to school there. It brought the collage artist Mark Wagner, who was also a Booklyn co-founder, um, Sarah Parkell, the printmaker. I mean, you had all these amazing printmakers at Madison who had New York profile, the Warrington Colescott, Jane Meyer, all kinds of folks. It's pretty amazing, and almost completely unknown in terms of art or print history. Like, because those Midwesterners are so freaking modest, they could never like cop to just how important. I mean, even Walter, who had a huge ego, as you know, as soon as he walked out of the studio or the classroom, he was like, okay, it's all good, very modest, very low key. But, you know, you get a letter from him or, you know, when he was in his home turf, it was all about him. But outside of that, he supported hundreds of people. And you know, you were kind of like a progressive version of Walter.
Well, and so many people that studied with him that went on to start their own presses. And also, I should really mention, Steve Miller, who was there in Wisconsin a bit before me, but went on to
Right,
start the book arts program in Alabama.
right,
So
right.
this family tree of book artists that came out of Wisconsin is pretty giant, actually, you know. And Bill Wee, I'd also like to mention him. He was very close friends with Joe Wilfer, and he was, again, so modest, but he did so much early printing before Ken Tyler or anyone with Sam Gilliam, who's now finally been, I mean, he was always recognized to a certain degree, but, huge now, right? And Alan Shields, and also printed the first chocolate room for Ed Ruscha. And I mean, he's so kind of unknown, as well as his artwork. So he, there was so much talent in that whole group of people that would kind of ebb and flow, and it was really a pipeline from Wisconsin to New York City, that's for sure.
So I'd like to shift a little gear and think more about like the future of artist books. And in considering that, I know Ruth, you've been invested for a long time in like apprenticeships and like passing on skills and the trade and the fee, and just kind of encourage younger people or people who are newer to the work. What would be your advice for people coming in after you, and that kind of includes any level, I guess. And then also, is there anything that you would actually like to see happen in the artist book field that maybe hasn't manifested? Maybe that's something that you is sort of like just on your bucket list, or just something that you've kind of itched your like desire to see happen, either in form or in like an organization that would manifest to provide something. But I'm curious about your thoughts about like the upcoming future, which includes next week. It could be next week, it could be the next 20 years. What
Right.
do you think?
Well, in terms of like advising people coming up in the field, I would just, I guess I would just say it's like to really sort of familiarize yourself with all the different branches, what I call the branches of book arts. There's so many different kinds of book arts being made, and it's I feel like it's kind of a splintered book arts world now. I don't know if you'd agree with that, but there's sort of the very expensive ones being made by major artists that are shown by their dealers, that people working at local like Center for Book Arts, might not even know exist, unless they specifically look for them, because they're not offered through a sort of specific bookseller. I mean, in the day, pre-internet, it was booksellers who got those things out. So one of my wishes is that, there could be more sort of archival material, in central locations. You really have to go dig around here, there, and everywhere, to find the things that you want to look at. Um, so I think it's like just realizing there are so many different tangents, and how do you want to go about that? I think we're lucky in this day and age because we have all these Center for Book Arts all around the country. There's so many of them now. And there's so many community sort of forums and places where you can, educate yourself and figure out how you want to proceed with your work in that medium. If you join those like online groups, there's all kinds of Facebook groups and community groups for different things that you could find your community of people. I think that's important in book arts. So you can make these connections to other people that can either help you, achieve your goals, or you can talk to about your goals. Wishes for the future. Yeah, I guess my wish is really to keep bringing it into, the mainstream and people's experience so more people can access it. And I know that's what I appreciate about you all at Booklyn, because I feel like you've done a great job with growing the organization and really getting things out there. So I commend you for that, both of you.
Oh, thank you. Your legacy in terms of the archive at the Clark Library of UCLA um, really was a major coup in terms of your relationship with Booklyn and my personal relationship with you. And um, I think the field itself, to be able to have the Clark Library, which is a major collection of fine press, like really traditional fine press, and you are one of the only women printmakers who have a comprehensive archive there. And so you've kind of, in one fell swoop, the acquisition of your archive has changed the entire focus of this major research institution. So now when people go to the Clark, they can see a book you made when you were 6 years old and all your family stuff and this incredible record of artist book and fine printmaking, which includes huge projects with Jim Dine and Lois Lane and Chuck Close and all kinds of people, Dwayne Reginald Betts, and you've again worked with hundreds of people. So, how do you feel about that?
I was really happy about that. Um, it's amazing to have everything in one collection. I know Walter, again, back to Walter Hamady, he told us save everything, save everything. And I kind of started to save everything. It was fun to go back through all this stuff I had and dig out and be like, wow, look at this. So I kind of amazed myself with all this stuff that I'd done over the years and all the giant proof sheets and the typography. So I think if someone is interested in that, there's a lot of process things. As I said, take for example the collab between Jeremy Sigler, poet, and Jessica Stockholder, painter sculptor, the artist book we made. That's still one of my favorites. That was exhibited at the Brooklyn Print Fair, my last copy. And that project went on for multiple years. We put 2 years in the prospectus. It was probably really 3 because it starts with meetings. And we had about 5 different dummies. And Jessica moved up to moved to New Haven to teach at Yale during the project. So it became a long distance project. So the back and forth, the compilation. So it's really fun to see this very basic dummy that had 100 pages where I just put 1 page of poetry, and then her to respond to that in a way or she's like, great, let's fill up 100 pages with images, which I was not mentally prepared for. But you see these processes happening in real time when you look at the dummies. And I do love that about the collection, that it has the process work for many, many things. And it really shows, it gives an awareness of all the things that go into a book that non-bookmakers may not realize. It's very different from printmaking in that way.
Your work has always had political content in one way or another, sometimes subtle. Your personal work is sometimes overtly political, and a
Yes.
lot of it really seems to be informed by your origins and
Hmm.
by that cooperative nature of the print shop itself.
Yes.
Like this idea of like print shops being places where there was like worker equality and equity, and this whole idea that is very Midwestern of a lot of printmakers are like, no, I don't need to sign it. You don't need to credit me. I'm doing the
Yes.
work, and it's the work first, not me.
Hmm.
Can you talk a little bit about how your upbringing, your
Hmm.
identification as a printer, and again being a woman in this kind of manned up world led to your kind of political consciousness and commitments, kind of being integrated into your art making?
I think so much of my political consciousness comes from my childhood and upbringing. My father was a Lutheran minister. So, and living in a rural community, farming, and he was a farmer before he became a minister. So you combine and Scandinavian heritage. So you combine I got the work ethic times three, shall we say. And so I think, but really this political consciousness thing was part of the Lutheran teachings at that time growing up. I remember cons as a child, raise collecting pennies for like starving children in Africa. It always, and the way my father, although stern, he was a very fun loving, charismatic man who always said he was called to God. And, and he had this, it was, the Lutheran churches I grew up in were cinder block little churches on the prairie. They were the most modest things, the antithesis of the Catholic Church, I might add. The only thing that got my dad angry was the Catholic Church thing, very touchy subject. Because, it was really that kind of, and it was, 70s, it was all about that kind of, I don't know, it was about we're a wealthy nation, we can afford to help other people, like kind of the antithesis of what you feel is the general feeling now. Like in some way, I know it's there, but that kind of political awareness, and even though we were very budgetarily restricted on a Lutheran minister's salary in South Dakota, but we were very hardworking, and I think that fostered so much creativity too. My dad was a photographer, and we would. That was my bond with him is we would drive around and he gave me a really nice black and white camera and we would drive around and take photos. And then he had a darkroom in the basement. So we go down and develop things. And I also helped him print his mimeograph, the church bulletins. So I really did. It's like I learned it all at a young age, the bookmaking thing. But that that consciousness was set there, and the hard work thing certainly was set there. So going into print shops, which were always community based, which were, I was always the night owl there. I'm going to pull an all nighter and I drag in with my boombox or whatever. And so would be in there. Hey, can you help me? Printing litho years ago, you always want a sponger. So it's always a two-person job. So this kind of idea of collaboration was always there.
Hmm.
So that's where that comes from. And again, the political thing, it just has always seemed like and the way I was brought up is like, we should feel like we're so lucky because you look at National Geographic and see all the suffering around the world. So we should feel very lucky that we were lucky to be born here and lucky to have what we have. And we should be helping other people. And, my dad would always say with money, you want to, when he'd send me a little money, he'd say, with money, you should always save some for a rainy day, spend some, have some fun, and give some to help others. That was what you should do. And that was a giant influence. And I think it just carries over into everything I do politically, which is those lessons I learned early, love thy neighbor, all that stuff.
It's so rare to see someone who can operate in so many different social spheres and cultural spheres. And I mean, you're just a very earnest person. Like you're not performing ever. I always like I feel like whoever you are, whether you're like, some huge collector patron or some kid who just stumbled into an internship, you always treat everyone with respect. It's kind of an amazing lesson just to see that at a human level. And then as an artist, yeah, just complete admiration for your talent and your skill and your ability to articulate. I know you thought you were getting a little granular, but the fact is there are very few people who can do the kind of work you do and speak coherently about it and teach about it, which is what I hear from everyone who's ever worked with you. It's very interesting to me, and there's so much. There's so much. We're hitting the tip of the iceberg here. There's so many memories I have of. I can remember walking into I think it was the studio I ran for Pace, and there was some giant press there, and you were saying, "Yeah, this can crush a car. It's got like 1,000 pounds of," and you were doing some crazy pulp paper printing. Um, it's just stuff that I could never have even imagined. And uh, one of the things that I often kind of tell people when they say, "Well, who's Ruth Lingen?" And I go, "Well, if you've been to a major museum and seen a big print by a famous artist, there's a 50% chance that Ruth printed that or made that paper." Like and it, and it's not hyperbole. That's what's kind of crazy about it. And only your modesty and the poor scholarship of the artist book and print world prevents that history from being more obvious.
Well, thank you, Marshall. I appreciate that. I think it was growing up with, people who were very handy and
Mm.
mechanical. So I never developed, and helping my dad fix cars. So I always felt very good around like printing equipment.
Amazing.
Thanks for listening to another episode of Booklyn Calling. If you are a librarian or a curator at an education institution and you're interested to see more work by Ruth Lingen, email us hello@booklyn.org or check out our catalog. There might be some items there. Ruth Lingen also has, Google is this marvelous toy you can use. It's everywhere. But we are happy to connect you to Ruth. We're happy to answer any questions about her. And thanks for joining us. See you next time on Booklyn Calling. This podcast was made possible in part by funds from the New York City Department of Cultural Affairs and in partnership with the City Council, and from individual donors to Booklyn Inc. You can support this podcast by making a donation at booklyn.org/donate.